And we have some news again in Illinois with the assault weapons ban. There's been a couple of updates. Can you just run us through what you wrote about this week?
Yeah, so it's been a little over a week as of this recording since that law has been in effect, and we've seen a lot of things happen in the interim. First and foremost, there's been a bevy of lawsuits. You have a couple state lawsuits that were filed almost immediately, and we now officially have our first federal lawsuit, which I wrote a piece on from the Illinois State Rifle Association, as well as the Firearms Policy Coalition and Second Amendment Foundation. So 3 fairly prominent actors in this gun rights space.
Yeah, and the Illinois State Rifle Association is an NRA affiliate, so you kind of get all the big players involved there.
That's right. Yeah, pretty much everyone except for Gun Owners of America that you would expect to see in a federal lawsuit.
And I'm sure they're working on something as well.
Yeah, you can almost guarantee. So you have that going in federal court, which is a big deal, obviously, because it's another vehicle for litigation on assault weapons bans, which is still fairly new after the Supreme Court's decision in Bruin. We're still kind of working out the jurisprudence, so that's something to keep an eye on for sure. And outside of the courts, you have law enforcement officials from all across the state. I think we're up to about 80 counties now have come out and said that they're just not going to enforce this new law. They say they think it's unconstitutional and that they will not expend county resources enforcing this law against folks that are just charged with noncompliance of the law. So if you're, committing other crimes, they might use it as a tack on, but they have no intention of just, sticking charges on people that refuse to register their previously lawfully purchased AR-15s.
Right. And this is sort of a new frontier for the Second Amendment sanctuary movement, right? This is local officials, local county officials pushing back on a gun control law that they view as unconstitutional. And frankly, they have a better case than ever before that it probably is, given what the Supreme Court ruled in Bruin and what some of the subsequent rulings in federal court have been, including where you are in Colorado, where you've seen assault weapons bans at the local level. There were some city and county bans there that have been struck down, or they've been blocked from enforcement by federal district court judges that actually were appointed by President Obama and President Biden. So you sort of are getting a preview of what might be to come for this Illinois law, especially given that the Supreme Court itself has granted, vacated, and remanded the Maryland assault weapon ban case, which the lower court had upheld the law. And so now the Supreme Court has vacated that ruling and told them to redo the case under its new standard in Bruin. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Supreme Court is going to come down on the side of these laws being unconstitutional, but I would think it's a fairly good sign that that's the case.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think the writing, as you said, that you never know with judges, but the writing is sort of on the wall that this probably isn't going to fly long term. So you have a weird dynamic now where state policymakers have sort of lashed out at the sheriffs that don't want to enforce this law, are kind of dismayed at all the bevy of lawsuits that are being filed, and they're left with, I guess, few options to see it enforced, right? Because there's not really much you can do to force the hand of these sheriffs. Right.
The governor has obviously come out and publicly attacked them, saying that they're grandstanding and this is, like a dereliction of duty, and that he's going to try and put political pressure on them to change their minds, or perhaps try and get them voted out of office, because these are elected positions, and they of course take their own oath of office to uphold the Constitution. And so from their point of view, obviously they believe this is would go against that oath, whereas the governor thinks otherwise, of course. But he doesn't really seem to have much in the way of options to push back against these sheriffs. He can use the state police to try and enforce this law, which he has alluded to the fact that he could do that. Of course, state police have very limited resources in reality for policing the entire state's gun-owning population. Without any help from local officials, I think that would be a Herculean task to try and go around and figure out who owns these guns and make sure that they've registered them, or throw them in jail otherwise, right? I mean, that's even just the idea of that is very politically charged. I would imagine if you just go around trying to round up gun owners who don't register their guns, that's going to get real unpopular real fast.
Yeah.
Even more so than it already is, especially in these areas with these sheriffs. But we've actually have an analog for this, historical analog. We talk a lot about that for the legal side of gun fights, but we have a recent historical analog for this exact situation, right? You wrote about this a little bit in an analysis piece that we just published over at the Reload, right?
Right. Yeah. Pretty similar to what happened in the aftermath of the 2013 New York SAFE Act, which was also a ban on so-called assault weapons and magazines. And it also included a registry requirement for gun owners that previously owned these banned weapons. And you saw sort of a similar dynamic where a lot of upstate, sort of rural New York County sheriffs came out in the aftermath of that and said, we don't plan to enforce this. Many of them said similar things like, we think this is unconstitutional. We don't support this type of legislation. And as a result,
what was the result?
Yeah. So as a result, you saw very, very limited compliance with the registration requirement. I think the National Shooting Sports Foundation at the time put out an estimate that there were something like 1 million weapons that would be covered under this ban at the time. Mm-hmm. And I think there was only a couple thousand that ended up getting.
There were 44,000 was the number that got released from a FOIA lawsuit.
Right.
A few years after the law was in effect. So that's, 4%.
Right.
Or so,
which is obviously a very, very small amount in a state that has over 20 million people. So
yeah, and the governor was never able to extract any sort of revenge on these sheriffs who
What can you do
to comply. And most of those guns presumably are still in the hands of the people who bought them initially. This is actually kind of how these confiscation laws work in the United States in the modern era. You pass a ban on possession of the gun, whether total ban or a ban for anyone who doesn't register them. And then you kind of just don't bother trying to go around and enforce that. You've seen this a number of times. The SAFE Act is a perfect example of it. There was no mass effort to try and enforce that ban. The idea is to cut off new sales, which it does. Of course, it's much easier to regulate the sale of firearms by legitimate dealers. Obviously, not to speak of illegitimate dealers who street dealers. They don't really care about any of these laws, of course. But it's easier to choke off the legal supply at the sales point than it is to try and go around and round up people, the guns from people who already have them, because most are not going to be willing to turn them in. And apparently most are not really willing to register them either, because I think there's a pretty fair expectation that registering them would, at the very least, make it much easier to confiscate them in the future, if not be sort of an inevitability.
Right.
So a lot of people view that as an inevitability, or an inevitable outcome.
Right.
That word is really tripping me up. But a lot of gun owners look at this, right? A lot of gun rights activists look at registration as merely a precursor to eventual confiscation. And there is some reason to think that that's the case.
I was going to say, we just had a recent example with the governor of Connecticut, right? Because around the same time of the SAFE Act, they passed a ban on assault weapons and included a registration requirement for grandfathered weapons. And then just, like a month or two ago, he came out and said, you know what, I'd like to revisit that and revoke the grandfathered status.
Right.
Now, his party isn't going along with him, but the fact that he's even willing to say that publicly kind of gives credence to that idea that down the road, this could lead to.
I will say that obviously there aren't that many registration laws here in the United States historically. So there aren't a lot of examples you can point to this occurring in the United States. There have been things like, New Jersey's magazine ban, for instance, where if you had a magazine that held more than 10 rounds back when the limit was 15, they passed a law to take it down to 10, and then you couldn't own or possess the ones you previously held. That's confiscation. That's another example, though, of a situation where basically there was no enforcement action taken. They made them illegal, and then if you happen to get caught with one, then you'll get charges, but otherwise they're not going around trying to find them.
Right.
That's just getting at how in practice these things have worked to this point. But I will say that in other countries, there are recent examples of exactly this phenomenon that we're talking about here, where registration did lead to confiscation, which New Zealand is sort of the most obvious recent example, where, they after a mass shooting there, they decided that all these guns that that they were targeting for removal would be confiscated through a mandatory buyback system, and they do have a registry there of who owns guns and what guns they own. So that makes it a much more practical idea, and so you can see why people have long opposed this concept. There's also sort of like there's not really a lot of other good reasons to have a registry, right? Other than potential confiscation down the line. There are a couple, perhaps, for taxing purposes would be one, but this isn't that. This is just registering everybody who has them. But either way, certainly I think that New York SAFE Act example is going to be a key one to give people an idea of what is likely to happen in this Illinois case, except that the big difference now is that 2013, there wasn't the Bruin ruling. In 2023, you have that precedent that's going to make it much more difficult for Illinois to justify this new law in court.